The sound was wrong. That's what Eli noticed first. He was in the basement of the century-old family home, patching up some water damage near the foundation. The house had been in his family for 4 generations, a fact he was deeply proud of. He knew its every creak and groan, the particular way the floorboards settled in the winter cold. But this sound was different. He tapped the masonry hammer gently against the wall again. Tap, tap, tap. Most of the wall returned the solid, satisfying thud of packed earth and thick brick. But one section, about the size of a small doorway, answered back with a hollow, empty echo. It was a pocket of nothingness where there should have been solid mass. He pulled the old rolled blueprints from a drawer, the ones his great-grandfather had drawn up when he built the place. He spread them on the workbench, the brittle paper cracking at the edges. He traced the lines of the basement foundation. According to the plans, this was a solid load-bearing wall. There was no room, no closet, no chimney flue indicated. The hollow space was a secret, a deviation from the official record. And that's when the memory surfaced, clear as day. His grandfather, sitting on the porch swing years ago, pointing a gnarled finger at the house. Some walls are best left alone, Eli. You understand? Some things, you just let sleeping dogs lie. He'd said it with a strange weight, a finality that had stuck with the boy. Now, standing before the mysterious hollow wall, the warning felt less like folksy wisdom and more like a specific instruction. A cold prickle ran down his spine, a mix of curiosity and a deep, instinctive unease. He looked from the blueprint to the wall, then back again. The house was keeping a secret. And against every cautious bone in his body, he decided he had to know what it was. The decision made, a nervous energy took hold. The mystery of the wall overshadowed the original repair job. He cleared the area, moving old paint cans and gardening tools to give himself space. He stood before the suspicious section, running his hands over the rough, cold bricks. They were the same aged red clay as the rest of the foundation, the mortar a slightly different shade, perhaps a touch newer, but still old enough to be crumbling in places. This was no recent addition. He chose a brick near the center of the hollow-sounding area, one where the mortar looked its weakest. He didn't want to make a mess. This needed to be surgical. He took a small chisel and a lightweight hammer, the tools feeling suddenly heavy and significant in his hands. This wasn't just demolition. This was archaeology. The first tap was tentative, more a scrape than a strike. A little puff of ancient dust and mortar powder puffed out. He tapped again, a bit firmer, working the chisel's edge into the fine line between bricks. The sound of metal scraping on aged cement was loud in the silent basement. He worked patiently, carefully loosening the bonds that had held this particular brick in place for who knows how long. His heart was thumping in a steady, nervous rhythm against his ribs. Finally, with a soft, grinding crunch, the brick shifted. It wasn't a dramatic moment, just a slight inward give. He wedged his fingers into the new gap, feeling the surprising chill of the space beyond. With a firm, careful pull, the brick came free. It wasn't the sight that hit him first. It was the smell. A gust of air rushed out from the dark opening, carrying with it the scent of undisturbed time. It was cold, incredibly cold, and carried the unmistakable odor of stale dust, old wood, and something else. Something dry and papery, like a library book that hadn't been opened in 100 years. It was the smell of a space completely sealed off from the world. He leaned forward, peering into the blackness. His own breathing sounded too loud. The light from the single bare bulb overhead did little to penetrate the gloom. He could make out nothing but an impenetrable darkness, a void that seemed to swallow the light whole. The hole was too small to see anything of substance, but the sheer presence of the space itself was overwhelming. A room, or a space of some kind that wasn't supposed to exist. Eli, everything okay down there? What's that smell? His wife, Sarah, called from the top of the stairs. Her voice, usually so comforting, made him jump. He took a step back from the wall, his mind racing. Yeah, fine. Just, found something weird. Can you bring down the big work light? And my phone. A moment later, her footsteps sounded on the wooden stairs. She appeared, holding the powerful LED work light and looking curious. Found what? She asked, then her nose wrinkled. Whoa, what is that? Smells like a museum attic. Look, he said, his voice low with a kind of reverence. He pointed at the single missing brick, the dark square it revealed like a missing tooth in a smile. Sarah's eyes widened. She came closer, peering into the hole just as he had. What is that? Is there a room back there? She shone the beam of his phone into the opening, but the light was too unfocused, too weak. It just illuminated the inside edges of the adjacent bricks. Help me with this, Eli said, his excitement beginning to override his trepidation. They unspooled the extension cord for the work light and positioned the sturdy metal stand so the lamp was aimed directly at the opening. Eli took a deep breath and flipped the switch. The blast of bright white LED light was transformative. It cut through the century of darkness like a knife. Where there had been nothing but black, shapes began to emerge. They weren't just looking into a small cavity. They were looking into a room, a very small, cramped room, but a room nonetheless. The light revealed rough-hewn stone walls continuing back about 6 or 7 feet. The floor was packed dirt, and everything, every surface, was covered in a thick, velvety layer of gray dust, completely undisturbed. It was like looking into a snow globe that hadn't been shaken in a lifetime. Then Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Eli, look, on the floor. He followed her pointing finger. There, sitting neatly in the very center of the small space, as if placed there carefully for someone to eventually find, was a small wooden box. It was dark wood, and even through the dust, they could see it was covered in intricate carvings. It looked ancient and utterly out of place in the rough, hidden cellar. The air from the room seemed to grow even colder. This wasn't just an abandoned space. Someone had left something behind. A message. A secret. Waiting. The box sat there in the cone of bright light, a silent testament to a deliberately hidden past. It was the only object in the entire small chamber, placed with such intention that it felt less like something forgotten and more like a message left for a specific recipient. The dust around it was perfectly smooth, untouched for decades. Eli and Sarah just stared at it for a long moment, the only sound the hum of the work light and their own held breaths. The initial thrill of discovery was now tempered by a profound sense of gravity. They weren't just uncovering an old space. They were about to open a conversation with whoever had sealed it shut. Reaching for it felt like a transgression. Eli hesitated, his hand hovering over the opening in the wall. He looked at Sarah, who gave a small, nervous nod. This was it. He had to know. He carefully reached through the brick gap, his arm disappearing into the cold, still air of the hidden room. His fingers brushed against the top of the box, disturbing the fine layer of dust and sending tiny particles dancing in the LED beam. The wood was surprisingly smooth under the grime. He wrapped his fingers around it. It was heavier than it looked, and gently lifted it, bringing it out from its century of solitude and into the light of the modern basement. They placed it on the cleared-off workbench. Under the bright light, the details emerged. It was made of a dark, rich wood, maybe walnut, and the carvings were exquisite. They weren't decorative flourishes. They told a story. There were stylized oak leaves and acorns, symbols of strength and potential. There were careful, interlocking patterns that spoke of protection and security. And along the sides, there were small, beautifully carved figures, children holding hands in a circle. The craftsmanship was incredible, the work of someone with immense skill and patience. The box itself was sealed shut, not with a lock, but with a simple, tarnished brass clasp. It clicked open with a soft, rasping sound that seemed deafening in the quiet room. Eli lifted the lid. The smell that wafted out was the same from the room, but more concentrated. Aged paper, dried ink, and that faint, sweet scent of cedar from the lining of the box. Inside, nestled perfectly, were two stacks. On one side, a small bundle of photographs, their edges deckled and brown. On the other, a tied bundle of letters, the paper brittle, the string around them fragile with age. This was a time capsule, a carefully preserved record. He picked up the photographs first, handling them by their edges. They were formal portraits, the kind taken in a studio a lifetime ago. The subjects were children, 8 of them, ranging from a girl who looked no more than 4 or 5 to a boy who might have been 12. They were dressed in their Sunday best, but the clothes were slightly ill-fitting, a little worn at the cuffs and collars. Their expressions were serious, somber, even for the era, but their eyes held a clarity, a quiet resilience. They were unfamiliar. Eli scanned the faces, turning each photo over. No names, no dates, just these silent, staring children, their story locked away in a box behind a wall. Then came the letters. He untied the delicate string with painstaking care. The top letter was dated June 17th, 1923. The handwriting was an elegant, flowing cursive, done with a fountain pen. He read it aloud, his voice barely a whisper, giving sound to words that hadn't been heard in 100 years. My dearest Eleanor, the arrangement holds, though the weight of it grows heavier with each passing season. They are safe. They are healthy. We continue to keep them safe from prying eyes and official inquiries. The town whispers, but the walls do not talk. Provisions are a constant worry, but we manage. They ask about their families, about the world outside. I tell them stories of a future where they will walk in the sun again. I pray it is not a lie. Keep faith. Burn this. Eli and Sarah looked at each other, the words hanging in the air. The arrangement, keep them safe. Official inquiries. The letter wasn't just old, it was evidence of a secret operation, a clandestine effort to hide these children. But from who and why? Sarah picked up one of the photographs again, the one of the oldest boy. She held it closer to the light, her brow furrowed in concentration. Eli, she said slowly, her voice taut with a new kind of tension. Look at his eyes, the shape of them, and his chin. She turned to him, her own eyes wide with dawning realization. Don't you see it? Eli, he looks just like your grandmother. I mean, exactly like her. A cold wave washed over him. He took the photo from her. He saw it instantly. The high cheekbones, the deep-set, thoughtful eyes, the slight cleft in the chin. It was uncanny. It was a face from his own family albums, but attached to a nameless child from 1923, a child who was apparently part of some dangerous secret that needed to be hidden behind a brick wall. The mystery had just collapsed inward, becoming deeply, terrifyingly personal. The hidden children weren't just anonymous figures from the past. One of them, it seemed, was a direct relative. The secret in the wall was, without a doubt, a family secret. The initial thrill of the discovery curdled into something heavy and complicated. The photographs and letters weren't just historical curiosities. They were live wires connected directly to their own family tree. The air in the basement, once charged with excitement, now felt thick and suffocating. Eli carefully placed the photograph of the boy, the one with his grandmother's eyes, back into the cedar-lined box, as if it might burn him. He closed the lid, the soft click sounding like a full stop on their brief moment of adventure. "We need to show your dad," Sarah said, her voice hushed. "He has to know about this. Maybe he knows something." Eli nodded, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. His father, Arthur, was the keeper of the family's history, the one who told the stories at holidays. But he was also a man who valued order and reputation above all else. He loved the house for its solidity, its permanence, not for its secrets. They found him in the living room, reading the newspaper. Eli placed the wooden box on the coffee table. "Dad, we found something in the basement." Arthur peered over his reading glasses, his expression one of mild curiosity. "More water damage? I told you that old pipe was trouble." "It's not the pipe," Eli said, opening the box. He took out the stack of photographs and handed them to his father. "We found a hidden room behind the foundation wall. This was inside." Arthur took the photos, his brow furrowed. He shuffled through them slowly, his expression unreadable. Then Eli handed him the letter from 1923. His father's eyes scanned the elegant cursive, his lips moving slightly as he read the words about the arrangement and keeping children safe. The room was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. When he finished, he didn't look up. He carefully placed the letter back on top of the photographs, slid them all back into the box, and closed the lid with a definitive snap. His face, when he finally looked at them, was not curious or shocked. It was closed, hard. "Where did you say you found this?" he asked, his voice flat. "In a hidden room, behind the bricks in the basement," Eli repeated, a defensive edge creeping into his tone. He could feel the energy shifting. Arthur waved a dismissive hand. "Nonsense. That's just some old junk, probably left by the previous owners before grandfather bought the place. Trinkets, old letters people forget about." He pushed the box away from him on the coffee table as if it were a dirty plate. Eli stared at him, baffled. "Dad, did you read it? It's dated 1923. Great-grandfather built this house in 1910. There were no previous owners. And look at this photo." He opened the box again, pulling out the picture of the boy. "Look at his face. He's the spitting image of Grandma Marie. This isn't junk. This is our family." Something flashed in Arthur's eyes then. Not recognition, but something darker. Annoyance. Anger even. "That's enough, Eli," he said, his voice low and stern, a tone he hadn't used since Eli was a teenager. "I don't see any resemblance. You're letting your imagination run wild. It's a box of old paper. That's all." "But the room itself," Sarah started. "I don't care about the room." Arthur's voice rose, startling them both. He stood up, his posture rigid. You will put that box back where you found it. You will brick that wall back up. Today, and you will not speak of this again. Do you understand me? Some things are better left buried. The reaction was so violent, so completely disproportionate to the situation, that it sucked all the air out of the room. This wasn't just dismissal. This was a command. This was fear. Dad, what aren't you telling us? Eli asked, standing his ground. Why would you want to just bury this? This could be important. Those kids, I said that's enough. Arthur's face was flushed. This is my house. You will respect my wishes. This conversation is over. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving them standing there in stunned silence, the beautiful, cursed box sitting between them on the table. The distance that opened up in that moment was more than just physical. It was a chasm. Eli looked at Sarah, seeing his own confusion and hurt reflected in her eyes. His father's anger hadn't just been about old family secrets. It felt personal, defensive, as if they had accused him of something. The mystery of the hidden room had just been eclipsed by a much more immediate and painful mystery. Why was his father so desperate to keep it hidden? The decision was made in that silent exchange of glances. They wouldn't be bricking up the wall, and they wouldn't be dropping this. They would find the truth, with or without his blessing. If his father was going to be a dead end, they would have to find the answers elsewhere. The next morning, with a determined sense of purpose, Eli and Sarah drove to the town historical society. It was housed in a beautiful Carnegie Library building, all granite and solemn silence. The air inside smelled of old books and lemon polish, a smell that promised answers held in careful custody. They were met by Mrs. Gable, the head archivist, a woman in her late 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a sweater that looked as old as some of the documents she cared for. Her demeanor was warm and professional, the exact opposite of the tension they had left at home. We're researching the history of our house, Eli explained, keeping his voice light. It's on Elm Street, the Carter House. It was built by my great-grandfather in 1910. Mrs. Gable's face lit up with recognition. Oh, the Carter place, a beautiful home, wonderful craftsmanship, one of the gems of that street. She led them into a research room with large wooden tables and brought out a large leather-bound ledger. This is the property record for that parcel. You should find the original deed and any subsequent transfers here. They pored over the elegant handwritten entries. There it was, 1910. Purchase of the land by Alistair Carter. Construction permit. Everything was orderly, official, and exactly as it should be. There was no mention of additional construction, no permits for modifying the foundation, no hint of a hidden room. The house, according to the town, was exactly what it appeared to be. Would there be any other records? Sarah asked. Maybe building plans that were submitted? Mrs. Gable shook her head. Not from that era, dear. The building inspector's office didn't keep copies of plans back then. What you have in your home is likely the only set in existence. She smiled apologetically. Is there something specific you're looking for? Eli hesitated. He couldn't mention the room, not after his father's reaction. We found some old family photographs, he said carefully. We're trying to identify some children in them, from around 1923. They might be distant relatives. Ah, well, for that, you'll want the census records, Mrs. Gable said, leading them to a bank of microfilm readers. We have them digitized now, bless the volunteers. Let's pull up the 1920 and 1930 censuses for your address. They spent the next hour scrolling through the flickering images of handwritten census forms. In 1920, the household was simple. Alistair Carter, 38, Eleanor Carter, 35, Arthur Carter, Eli's grandfather, 8, two live-in housemaids, a typical affluent family of the time. They pulled up the 1930 census with bated breath. Alistair, Eleanor, Arthur, now 18. The two housemaids were different, but that was it. No other children, no extra names, no record of 8 additional souls living in the house. It was as if the children in the photographs and the letters had never existed. The official record had completely erased them. "This is strange," Sarah murmured, more to herself than to anyone. Mrs. Gable, who had been quietly organizing files nearby, overheard. "Trouble finding your relatives?" she asked. "It's just, we have photos of children who should have been living there in 1923, but they're not in the 1920 or 1930 census," Eli explained, frustration seeping into his voice. Mrs. Gable nodded slowly, a thoughtful, almost cautious look on her face. 1923, you say? That was a difficult time. The typhoid outbreak was in the fall of 1922. It hit the orphanage on the west side of town particularly hard. A terrible tragedy. Many children were left without families. She spoke softly, as if recounting a sad old story. Eli and Sarah exchanged a glance. Typhoid, an orphanage. The pieces were starting to form a horrifying picture. After the outbreak, Mrs. Gable continued, her voice dropping even further, there was a scandal. Town officials were accused of mishandling the relief efforts. There was talk of sending the surviving orphans to workhouses upstate. Dreadful places. The whole affair was very hushed up. The official records from that period are spotty. A lot of documents were lost. She made air quotes around the word lost, her expression implying something more deliberate. She looked at them, her kind eyes now holding a glint of warning. When you dig into old family histories from that time, you sometimes find gaps, stories that don't quite match the paperwork. Families around here, the old families, they have their stories, but they don't always like to tell them. She gave them a meaningful look. Sometimes the past is best remembered quietly. It was the same sentiment his grandfather had expressed, the same warning his father had just shouted. Let sleeping dogs lie. Some things are better left buried. The past is best remembered quietly. They thanked Mrs. Gable, their minds reeling. The trip to the archives had been a failure in one sense. They'd found no official proof of the hidden children. But in another, much larger sense, it was a staggering success. They hadn't found a record of the children, but they had found the reason why there wouldn't be a record. A typhoid outbreak, a scandal, lost documents, the cryptic warning of a town that had collectively agreed to forget. The hidden room was no longer just a family mystery. It was a piece of a much larger, darker town history. And their family, it seemed, had been right at the heart of it. The drive home from the Historical Society was silent, thick with the weight of what they'd learned. The sterile, official world of census records and property deeds had completely failed them. But the whispered history from Mrs. Gable had painted a picture far more vivid and terrifying than any document could. They weren't just looking for missing relatives. They were potentially uncovering an act of clandestine resistance against a town's corruption. The hidden room was no longer a curiosity. It was a crime scene, or perhaps a sanctuary. They had to go back. They had to look again. The basement felt different now, colder, heavier. The single opening in the wall was a black eye staring back at them. They set up the work light once more, its beam cutting a stark white path into the darkness. This time, their search was more systematic, less about the thrill of discovery and more about the grim work of investigation. They were looking for evidence. Eli widened the hole, carefully removing a few more bricks to create an opening large enough to step through. The rush of stale, cold air was familiar now, a breath from a sealed tomb. He ducked his head and stepped into the small, cramped space. The floor was hard-packed earth, cold even through the soles of his shoes. The dust, a century thick, poofed up around his feet with every step, settling on his jeans. He moved the beam of a powerful flashlight slowly across the walls, the rough-hewn stone glistening faintly with a mineral dampness. The room was empty, save for the lingering impression in the dust where the wooden box had sat. He was about to turn back, satisfied they had found the only artifact, when the light caught something tucked into a shallow recess in the wall, a natural alcove formed by two uneven stones. It wasn't placed prominently like the box. It was hidden, deliberately concealed. He reached in, his fingers brushing against something small and hard. He pulled it out. It was a toy, a simple, handmade horse carved from a pale, soft wood like pine. It was crude, the work of an amateur hand, but carved with obvious love and patience. The shape was unmistakable. A proud stallion with a flowing mane that had been carefully etched with a knife. It was small enough to fit snugly in a child's palm. He brought it out into the light of the basement. Sarah took it from him, turning it over in her hands with a reverence that bordered on sadness. The wood was smooth in places from what must have been countless hours of handling. "Look," she whispered, her voice catching. She pointed to the underside of the horse, near its belly. There, carefully carved into the wood, were two initials. J.W. Eli ran through the family tree in his mind. His great-grandfather was Alistair. His grandfather was Arthur. His father was Arthur Jr. There were no J.W.s, no Johns, no Josephs, no Jameses with a last name starting with W. The initials belonged to a stranger. Then Sarah's breath hitched. She was staring not at the toy, but at the fine layer of dust that had coated it. She held it under the work light, tilting it slowly. "Eli," she said, her voice trembling. "The dust. Look at the dust." He leaned in. The toy had been covered, like everything else, in the uniform gray powder of ages. But where small fingers would have gripped it, around the horse's body, along its back, the dust was different. It was smudged. It was patterned. The faint, unmistakable whorls and lines of fingerprints were preserved in the ancient grime. A child had held this. A specific child with the initials J.W. had clutched this homemade toy in this dark, hidden room. They hadn't just found an object. They had found a person. The realization was a physical blow. This wasn't an abstract historical puzzle anymore. A real child had lived in this cold, dark space. They had played with this toy. They had left their mark on it, a ghostly signature preserved in dust. The arrangement mentioned in the letters, the secret kept from the authorities, it had a face now. It had a name. J.W. The weight of it, the profound, heartbreaking reality of it, settled over them in the silent basement. Someone had lived here. J.W. The initials burned in Eli's mind. They needed a key, someone who could unlock those letters and connect them to a real person. Their thoughts turned immediately to the family's oldest living member, his great-aunt Beatrice, his grandfather's sister. She was 94, sharp as a tack, and lived in a tidy assisted living facility on the outskirts of town. She was the family historian, the keeper of the photo albums and the anecdotes that didn't make it into the official stories. If anyone knew something, it would be her. They called ahead, and the next day they sat with her in her sunny, floral print sitting room, the wooden horse and one of the photographs carefully wrapped in a soft cloth in Eli's lap. Aunt Beatrice poured tea from a delicate china pot, her hand steady, her eyes bright with curiosity. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" she asked, smiling. "It's not my birthday, and you two look far too serious for a social call." Eli took a breath. "Aunt B, we found something in the basement of the old house. Something unexpected." Her smile didn't falter, but a subtle watchfulness entered her eyes. "Oh? Dad's old stamp collection finally turn up? Mother always said he hid it from the tax man." She gave a light, tinkling laugh. "It's not stamps," Eli said gently. He unwrapped the cloth, first revealing the photograph of the 8 children. He handed it to her. "We found this. Do you recognize any of them?" Beatrice took the photo, pulling her reading glasses from her sweater pocket. She studied it for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She turned it over, looking for a caption that wasn't there. Her smile had vanished, replaced by a careful neutrality. "Old photos," she murmured. "So many faces from back then, it's hard to say. Could be a school picture, a church group." She handed it back, her movements just a little too quick. "Wherever did you find it?" "Behind a wall," Sarah said softly, "in a room we didn't know was there." The effect was instantaneous. The color drained from Beatrice's face. The pleasant, social mask she wore slipped, revealing something beneath it. Alarm. Pure, undiluted alarm. Her hands, which had been so steady, began to tremble slightly. She set her teacup down with a sharp clink against the saucer. "A room?" she repeated, her voice thin. "What nonsense! That house doesn't have any extra rooms. Your grandfather would have mentioned it. You must be mistaken. An old root cellar, perhaps. They sealed a few of those up over the years." She was talking too fast, her words tripping over each other. "We also found this," Eli said, his heart aching at her obvious distress. He held out the small wooden horse. "It has initials, JW." Aunt Beatrice looked at the toy as if it were a venomous snake. She didn't reach for it. She drew her hands back into her lap, clutching them together. Her breath came in a short, sharp gasp. "I don't know what that is," she whispered, but her eyes were fixed on it, wide with a fear that was decades old. "Beatrice, please," Sarah said, leaning forward, her voice full of empathy. "We know about the typhoid outbreak. We know about the orphanage. We just want to understand. Who were they? Who was JW?" The old woman shook her head, a frantic, jerky motion. Tears welled in her eyes. "No, no, you mustn't. You have to stop this." Her voice was a desperate plea. "It's over. It's done. It was all so long ago. Why can't you just let it be?" "Because they were children," Eli said, his own voice thick with emotion. "They were hidden in our house. Our family did that. Don't we owe it to them to know their story?" For a split second, he saw it, a crack in her defenses, a flicker of memory, of pain in her ancient eyes. Her lips parted as if she might speak, might finally unburden herself of whatever truth she was carrying. And then she said it, the words slipping out in a rush of anguish before she could stop them. "I promised I would never speak of that business. I was just a girl, but I promised." She caught herself immediately, her hand flying to her mouth. The slip was out. The admission hung in the air, shattering her denials. She knew. She hadn't just heard stories. She had been there. She had been part of it. The moment of vulnerability vanished, replaced by a wall of pure terror. She stood up, unsteady on her feet. You need to leave, now. Put it all back. Brick up the wall and forget you ever saw it, for your own good, for this family's good. She was crying openly now, tears tracking through her powder. Please, Eli, for me, just let the past stay dead. They left soon after, their hearts heavy. They had gone seeking answers and had instead inflicted pain on a beloved old woman. But they had gotten their answer nonetheless. Aunt Beatrice's fear, her slip of the tongue, that business, confirmed everything. The secret was real. It was dark. And it was so dangerous that even 94 years later, it still had the power to terrify. Their investigation, however, was far from over. It had just become a race against time and against a family determined to keep its secrets buried. Aunt Beatrice's fear was a beacon. It didn't scare them off, it pointed them directly back to the source. Her terror confirmed that the most important answers weren't in town records or family stories. They were still in that room. They had been too gentle before, too respectful of the dust and the silence. Now they returned with a new purpose, to tear the secret out of its hiding place, brick by brick, if they had to. They went back down to the basement, the air feeling charged with a new, grim energy. The small opening in the wall seemed to mock them. They needed to see everything. Eli fetched a crowbar. This feels wrong, Sarah said, watching him as he positioned the tool against the mortar of another brick. Everything about this feels wrong, Eli replied, his jaw set. But being wrong is better than not knowing. She's terrified, Sarah. What are they so afraid of? He put his weight into it. The sound of cracking mortar and shifting stone was loud and violent in the small space. He wasn't being careful anymore. He pulled bricks out, stacking them haphazardly on the basement floor, until the opening was large enough to walk through without ducking. The hidden room yawned before them, its cold, dead air washing over them like a wave. They stepped inside together, their flashlight beams sweeping across every inch of the rough stone walls. They looked for anything they had missed. Another alcove, a loose stone, a floorboard that wasn't there. They were about to give up, to admit that the wooden box and the toy were the only treasures this place held, when Eli's light passed over a section of the wall opposite the entrance. There was nothing remarkable about it. It was the same rough, uneven masonry as the rest of the room, but something about the way the shadows fell. He moved closer, running his hands over the cold, damp stone. His fingers found a slight irregularity. One stone, about eye level, seemed to have a hairline crack around its edges that the others didn't. It wasn't mortar holding it in place. It was a perfect, tight fit. He wedged the tip of the crowbar into the minute gap and pushed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft, grating sound, the entire stone shifted inward an inch. It wasn't a structural stone, it was a plug, a hidden compartment within a hidden room. His heart hammered against his ribs. He worked the stone out carefully. It was heavier than it looked. Behind it was a deep, narrow niche, black with shadow. He reached in, his fingers brushing against something soft yet solid. Leather. He pulled it out. It was a book. A small, leather-bound journal, its cover worn, smooth and dark with age, tied shut with a narrow strip of faded ribbon. It was cold to the touch and smelled profoundly of time and earth. This was it, the core of the mystery, the truth, handwritten. They took it back to the workbench, their hands trembling. Eli untied the fragile ribbon, which crumbled slightly at the edges. He opened the cover. The pages were filled with the same elegant, flowing cursive from the letters, but this was denser, more hurried. The private thoughts of the person who had lived this secret day by day. The first entry made the breath catch in his throat. He read it aloud, his voice hushed with awe. October 12th, 1921. They're here now, the Johnson children from the old Miller place. The health officials came for them this morning, said they were to be taken to the county home for observation after the fever took their parents. We all know what that means. The workhouses. Eleanor and I could not let it stand. Alistair has built the space in the cellar. No one must know. The weight of this is immense. God forgive us if we are discovered. He turned the page, the paper crackling softly. The entries were a torrent of fear, resolve, and desperate love. November 3rd, 1921. Little Mary cried for her mother all night. We dare not comfort her too loudly. The walls are thick, but fear makes every sound a cannon shot. January 15th, 1922. Provisions are a constant struggle. Arthur is too young to understand why he must sometimes go hungry so the little ones may eat. He sees them as rivals for our affection, not as souls we are, saving from a hellish fate. How does one explain such a thing to a child? March 30th, 1922. A scare today. A man from the town council came by asking questions about unregistered residents. Alistair met him with calm denial. I listened from the top of the stairs, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure the man would hear it. He left unsatisfied. The danger is ever present. June 17th, 1923. The arrangement holds, though the weight of it grows heavier with each passing season. He stopped reading. It was the letter, the one they had found in the box. This was the source. This journal was the raw, unfiltered truth from which those carefully worded, hopeful letters had been distilled. The writer, Eleanor, his great-grandmother, wasn't just participating in a secret. She was living in a state of perpetual righteous terror, documenting every anxious moment, every scrap of hope, every heartbreak. She was keeping them hidden from the authorities, not for mischief, but for salvation. They were reading the diary of a quiet, desperate resistance. And with every turned page, the ghosts in the photographs began to breathe again. They had names. They had fears. They had a story. And it was a story of incredible courage. The diary was a key that unlocked 100 silent years. Eli and Sarah read it cover to cover, their world narrowing to the small circle of light on the workbench, the soft rustle of brittle pages, the only sound. They learned names, the Johnson children, Mary, James, and little Thomas, the O'Malley twins, Fiona and Sean, Benjamin Wells, and the boy from the photograph, the one with their grandmother's eyes, Jacob Weber. J.W., the pieces of the story, once scattered and mysterious, snapped together into a heartbreakingly clear picture. 8 children, orphaned by typhoid and targeted by a corrupt town council for the workhouse system, were given sanctuary in the hidden cellar of the Carter home. They weren't prisoners, they were refugees. Their great-grandparents weren't criminals, they were heroes who had risked everything, their freedom, their standing, their own son's comfort, to do what was right. But the story didn't end in 1923. The final diary entries spoke of careful, secretive placements. The children, given new names and new histories, were gradually sent to live with trusted families in distant towns. their true origins erased to protect them and the Carters from prosecution. They were scattered to the wind, their pasts buried deep. The question now was a living, breathing one. Did any of them survive? Did they have children? Grandchildren? Were there people walking around right now completely unaware that their entire family history was a beautiful, necessary lie? The quest moved from the dusty basement to the bright, digital world. They started with the diary's most concrete lead, Jacob Weber. If he was the spitting image of Eli's grandmother, the genetic link had to be strong. They spent days hunched over their laptops, their dining table transformed into a command center. They cross-referenced the names from the diary with digitized birth, marriage, and death records from surrounding counties, looking for any trace of a Jacob Weber who appeared out of nowhere in the mid-1920s. It was painstaking, frustrating work. The trail was cold, deliberately obscured. But then, a breakthrough. Sarah found a marriage record from 1938 for a Jacob Walker and a woman named Clara Evans in a town 60 miles away. The age was right, Walker Weber. It was a simple, logical alteration, a single letter changed to create a new identity. They followed Jacob Walker. Census records showed he worked as a carpenter. He and Clara had 3 children. Those children grew up, had children of their own. The family tree branched out, robust and full. Jacob Weber, the boy who hid in a cellar, didn't just survive. He thrived. He built a life. They found others, too. A birth record for a Fiona O'Connell, née O'Malley. A death notice for a respected schoolteacher named Benjamin Wallace. The pattern was the same. New last names, new towns, new lives built on a foundation of silence. The 8 hidden children didn't vanish. They became teachers, carpenters, nurses, mothers, and fathers. Their descendants were now doctors, engineers, artists. They were everywhere. The secret act of compassion in 1921 had rippled outward through time, creating dozens, perhaps hundreds of people who owed their very existence to the courage of Eli's ancestors. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. They weren't just looking at a historical fact. They were looking at a living legacy. And with that realization came the crushing weight of an ethical dilemma. These people had lived their entire lives with a certain story, a certain identity. Did they have a right to know the truth? To know that their grandparents were survivors of a terrible injustice? That their name was a shield crafted for their protection? Or was the truth a grenade that would blow up their sense of self, their family narrative? Was unearthing this secret, no matter how noble the original intent, an act of kindness or a profound violation? They debated it for hours, the gravity of the decision keeping them up at night. They had the power to rewrite dozens of family histories. It felt like playing God. But the alternative, leaving the truth buried while the descendants lived with gaps and unanswered questions, felt like a betrayal of the children in the diary and of the great-grandparents who had sacrificed so much for them. The secret had been kept out of fear. That fear, they decided, had lasted long enough. They chose one person to start with, Michael Walker, Jacob's grandson. He was a graphic designer, his life neatly documented on a professional website and social media. He seemed grounded, thoughtful. They crafted an email together, their words cautious and reverent. They didn't dump the whole story. They simply said they were researching local history and had come across some information that might be connected to his grandfather Jacob's early life. They mentioned they had photographs and documents. They asked gently if he would be open to seeing them. They sent it from a new, anonymous email account, their hearts in their throats. They had just thrown a stone into a still pond, and they had no idea what the ripples would look like. The reply came 2 days later. It was brief, polite, and brimming with a confused curiosity. Michael Walker was indeed interested. His grandfather had always been strangely quiet about his childhood, deflecting questions with vague stories about moving around a lot. There was a family legend about a fire destroying all the early records, but it never quite rang true. He was, he wrote, incredibly intrigued. They arranged a video call for the following evening. When the hour came, Eli and Sarah sat side by side at their computer, the digitized photographs and scanned diary entries pulled up on the screen. They clicked the link, and Michael's face appeared. He was a man in his 40s with kind eyes and a head of curly hair. He looked normal, solid, real. The abstract concept of a descendant had just become a person. "Hi," Eli began, his voice slightly hoarse with nerves. "Thanks for making the time. This is going to be a strange conversation." Michael smiled. "I have to admit, your email has had me baffled for 2 days. I've been racking my brain trying to figure out what you could possibly have about my granddad. He was a pretty simple guy, a carpenter, loved his family, loved his garden." "That's what we thought we'd start with," Sarah said gently. She shared her screen, bringing up the studio photograph of the 8 children. "Do you recognize anyone in this picture?" Michael leaned closer to his camera, his expression one of concentrated effort. He scanned the faces of the serious, formally dressed children. His gaze passed over them, then snapped back to the oldest boy. He went very still. The casual curiosity on his face melted away, replaced by something deeper, more profound. "That's," he stammered, pointing at the screen, "that's my grandfather, Jacob. I mean, it's a childhood photo I've never seen, but that's him, without a doubt. How, how do you have this?" The confusion in his voice was now edged with a tremor of something else, anticipation, maybe even fear. Eli took a slow breath. "The photo was taken in 1923. It was found in our house, my family's house. It was built by my great-grandfather, Alistair Carter." The name meant nothing to Michael. He just shook his head, his eyes fixed on the image of his young grandfather. I don't understand. Why would a picture of my grandfather be in your house? Our family's never, we're not from there." "This is the difficult part to explain," Eli said. He shared the scanned image of the first diary entry. "This is from a journal kept by my great-grandmother, Eleanor Carter, dated October 12th, 1921. Michael read the entry silently, his lips moving. "They're here now, the Johnson children from the old Miller place. The health officials came for them this morning. We could not let it stand. Alistair has built the space in the cellar." His face paled. He looked from the diary to the photograph, then back to Eli and Sarah on the screen. The pieces were there, but they weren't connecting in a way that made sense. "The typhoid outbreak," Sarah said softly, her voice full of empathy. "The town council was sending orphaned children to workhouses. Your grandfather, Jacob Weber, was one of them. My husband's great-grandparents. They hid them in a secret room in their basement. They kept them safe, and then, when it was safer, they helped them find new homes, new families, new identities, to protect them." She brought up the scan of the marriage record, Jacob Weber becoming Jacob Walker. The final concrete piece of evidence. The silence on the other end of the call was absolute. Michael stared at the screen, his hand over his mouth. He wasn't confused anymore. He was processing the vague stories, the missing history, the grandfather who was beloved but always carried a quiet sadness. It was all crashing into place, forming a new, terrifying, and beautiful picture. He never talked about it, Michael finally whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He would just get this faraway look sometimes. My dad said he was like that too. We just thought, I don't know what we thought. He looked up, tears glistening in his eyes. He was saved. Your family. They saved him. They saved all of them. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just looked at the photograph of the boy who became the man he knew, his expression a turbulent mix of grief for the childhood that was stolen and overwhelming gratitude for the childhood that was given back. The emotional impact was visible, a seismic shift happening in real time. He wasn't just learning a new fact about his family. He was learning a new truth about his own origin story. He was learning that his existence was rooted not in tragedy, but in an act of profound and secret courage. The hidden room had finally, after a century, given one of its children back his name. The conversation with Michael Walker changed everything. It was no longer just their secret, their family's burden. The truth belonged to the descendants now, to the town that had tried to bury it. The weight of that responsibility settled on Eli and Sarah's shoulders, a heavy but purposeful mantle. They couldn't, in good conscience, be the sole keepers of this story. It was a piece of local history, a testament to both human cruelty and incredible compassion. The town needed to know. But how do you tell a community it has been wrong about its own past for 100 years? They started with the Historical Society. They requested another meeting with Mrs. Gable, but this time they brought evidence. They laid it all out on the large wooden table. The scanned diary entries, the photographs of the children, the marriage record of Jacob Weber becoming Jacob Walker. They told her the whole story, from the hollow sound in the wall to the emotional call with Michael. Mrs. Gable listened in utter silence, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She didn't interrupt. As the narrative unfolded, the hidden room, the typhoid orphans, the clandestine rescue operation, the manufactured identities, her professional composure slowly dissolved. The color drained from her face. When Eli finished, she simply sat back in her chair, looking not at them, but through them, as if seeing the ghosts of 1922 parading through her quiet research room. My God, she breathed, the words barely audible. She reached out a trembling hand and gently touched the printout of the diary's first entry. All these years, the rumors. We all heard the whispers, of course. The Carter place has secrets, they'd say. But we thought it was money. Bootlegging during Prohibition, perhaps. Not this. Never this. She looked up at them, her eyes swimming with tears. We are the keepers of this town's history, and we missed the most important story of all. Her reaction wasn't one of skepticism or dismissal. It was one of stunned, humbled awe. She immediately understood the historical significance. This wasn't a family scandal. It was a story of moral courage that rewrote the narrative of a dark chapter in the town's history. This must be shared, she said, her voice gaining strength with her conviction. The society will help you. We have a platform. We can host a presentation, create an exhibit. The descendants, they deserve to be recognized. Word, as it does in small towns, began to leak almost immediately. A local reporter, a woman who had written a fluff piece about the Historical Society's Rose Garden the previous summer, got a tip. She called Eli, her voice buzzing with the keen instinct of a journalist who has just stumbled onto the story of a lifetime. She was respectful but persistent, and after consulting with Michael Walker, who was eager for his grandfather's saviors to receive their due, Eli agreed to an interview. The article appeared on the front page of the Weekly Gazette the following Sunday. The headline was restrained but powerful. Local History Unearthed. Century-Old Secret Reveals Act of Heroism. It laid out the facts with a careful, dignified tone, focusing on the Carters' bravery and the children's survival. It included a photograph of the hidden room's entrance and a cropped image of the children, their faces solemn and hopeful. The reaction across the community was a tidal wave. The Historical Society's phone rang off the hook. The story was shared thousands of times on social media, with people from the town and beyond expressing shock, pride, and a thirst for more details. For many, it was a point of immense local pride, a story of their town's citizens standing up to corruption. For the older families, the ones Mrs. Gable had alluded to, the reaction was more mixed. There were quiet acknowledgments, murmured admissions that they'd always heard something about that. But there was also a palpable unease, a sense of old, settled dust being kicked up. The official story of the typhoid aftermath had been one of tragic loss and moving on. This new version introduced a conscious, shameful villainy on the part of the town fathers of the time. It made people look at their own family names in the old ledgers and wonder which side of history they had been on. The revelation was out, and it was shaking the foundations of the town's identity, just as it had shaken the foundation of Eli's home. The newspaper article was the final straw. It sat on the kitchen table between them, the bold headline, a silent accusation. Eli's father, Arthur, had said nothing when he saw it. He'd just picked it up, read it with a stony expression, and set it back down with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world. The silence in the house had been thick and heavy for 2 days, a palpable tension that everyone tiptoed around. The secret was public knowledge now, celebrated by the town, but it had built a higher, colder wall within their own home. Finally, on the third evening, Arthur appeared in the doorway of the living room where Eli and Sarah were sitting. He looked older, the lines on his face deeper, his shoulders slumped under an invisible burden. He didn't look angry anymore. He just looked tired, defeated. "We need to talk," he said, his voice gravelly. He sat heavily in his armchair, opposite the sofa. He stared at his hands for a long moment, as if searching for the right words in his weathered palms. "I owe you an apology," he began, not looking up. "The way I reacted, it was wrong. I was scared. I've been scared of that wall my entire life." Eli and Sarah stayed silent, letting him find his way through the story he'd been ordered never to tell. "My father," Arthur continued, "your grandfather, he took me down to the basement a week before he died. I was 17. He pointed to that exact spot on the wall, the one you found." His hands were shaking. He told me that behind those bricks was a secret so big it could break our family. He said it was a story of good people doing a bad thing, or maybe bad people doing a good thing. He said he could never quite decide which. The law had been broken, a big law, and even though it was for the right reasons, the law didn't care about reasons. He finally looked up, his eyes haunted. "He made me swear on my mother's grave that I would never, ever open that wall. He said if the truth ever got out, we could still be held responsible. Fined. The house could be seized. Our name would be mud. He..." painted a picture of utter ruin. He said, "Arthur, you promise me. You let sleeping dogs lie. You protect this family." And I promised. I was a kid, and I was terrified of disappointing him, and I promised. He took a shaky breath. For 50 years, I've kept that promise. I've avoided that corner of the basement. I've had nightmares about it. Every time there was a knock on the door, a part of me thought, this is it. They've found out. I lived with a low-grade dread that never went away. And then you two, you just walked in and started tapping on the walls. He gave a sad, hollow laugh. My first instinct wasn't curiosity, it was sheer panic. All I could hear was my father's voice, and all I could feel was the weight of that promise. He looked at Eli, his expression raw with a shame he'd carried for decades. When I shouted at you, when I called it junk, I wasn't trying to be cruel. I was trying to protect you. I was trying to keep you from inheriting this fear, this life of looking over your shoulder. I thought if I could just make you stop, if I could make you bury it again, I could keep you safe. I could keep my promise to my father. Tears welled in his eyes. But the truth is, I was also ashamed. Ashamed that I was too afraid to ever want to know. Ashamed that my first thought was of protecting our reputation, not of uncovering the truth. You were brave. You saw a mystery, and you pursued it, no matter how uncomfortable it got. You did what I was too frightened to do for 50 years. You found the heroes in our family, and I was only ever worried about the criminals. The confession hung in the air, a lifetime of fear finally given voice. The rigid, angry man was gone, replaced by a vulnerable one burdened by a promise made to a dying parent. The chasm that had opened between them days before began to close. Not with a dramatic crash, but with the quiet, profound understanding that comes from finally seeing someone's hidden pain. The secret hadn't just been hidden behind a wall. It had been living inside him, a ghost he'd been feeding with his silence for half a century. With the truth fully out in the open and the family rift beginning to heal, the energy in the town shifted from shock to action. The story was too powerful, too important, to be left as a historical footnote. It demanded a physical presence, a lasting acknowledgement. Mrs. Gable from the Historical Society became the driving force. Her earlier hesitation transformed into a fierce determination to set the record straight. A community meeting was called at the town hall. It was packed, not with curious onlookers, but with people who felt a personal connection to the story. There were descendants of the original town officials, their expressions a complex mix of discomfort and a desire to make amends. There were elderly residents who remembered the whispered stories. And there were people like Michael Walker, who had driven in to be part of the conversation. Eli and his father sat together, a silent testament to the reconciliation the story had fostered. The proposal was unanimous and passionate. The hidden room would not be sealed again. Instead, the bricked-up doorway would be fully opened and fitted with a sturdy glass panel, turning the small, cold space into a permanent, quiet memorial. It wouldn't be a museum exhibit. It would be a sanctuary. A place to remember the 8 children who hid there and the family who gave them shelter. The Historical Society would curate a small display in their main hall with copies of the photographs and diary entries, telling the full, unvarnished story. The project became a town-wide effort. A local glazier donated the thick, custom-cut glass for the doorway. A carpenter, a grandson of Benjamin Wallace, offered to build a beautiful, simple frame for it, carving the 8 children's initials into the wood. Volunteers helped clean and gently preserve the room itself, careful not to disturb the layer of dust on the floor, leaving the faint ghost of a child's footprint near the wall untouched. It was a sacred space, and they treated it with the reverence it deserved. The day of the dedication was unseasonably warm and bright. A small crowd gathered in Eli's backyard, spilling into the open basement door. The atmosphere was not celebratory, but deeply respectful, hushed. Mrs. Gable said a few words about the importance of remembering all of history, both the light and the dark. Michael Walker spoke, his voice thick with emotion, thanking the town for finally acknowledging his grandfather's story and the family that saved him. He talked about the weight of the unknown being lifted, replaced by a profound sense of belonging to a larger, braver narrative. Then it was Eli's father's turn. He stepped forward, looking out at the crowd, his earlier fear replaced by a quiet pride. "My father asked me to keep a secret to protect this family," he said, his voice clear and strong. "But today, we are not protecting a secret. We are honoring a truth. We are recognizing that this family's legacy isn't one of fear, but of courage. And we are opening our doors to share that courage with all of you." It was a full, public repudiation of the promise that had haunted him, and a healing balm for his own shame. Finally, the glass was unveiled. The work light inside the room was turned on, and for the first time, the hidden space was illuminated not as a dark secret, but as a place of honor. People filed past quietly, peering through the glass at the small wooden horse still sitting on a ledge, at the rough-hewn walls, at the packed earth floor. They weren't looking into a closet or a crawl space. They were looking into a chapter of their town's soul. The memorial was simple, powerful, and perfect. It didn't shout, it whispered. And its whisper told a story of incredible humanity. In the weeks that followed the dedication, a deep and quiet change settled over Eli. The frantic energy of the investigation, the confrontations with his father, the nervous excitement of the reveal. It all faded, leaving behind something more permanent and profound. His understanding of family, of legacy, had been completely rewritten. He had always seen the house as a symbol of permanence, a sturdy, unchanging monument to his lineage. Now he saw it as something far more dynamic. It was a vessel that had carried a secret, a silent witness to an act of tremendous moral courage. The pride he felt was no longer just for the solid beams and the well-laid bricks. It was for the compassion that had pulsed within those walls, hidden from view, but no less foundational to the structure of his family. His ancestors weren't just builders, they were protectors. They were people who saw an injustice and quietly, at great personal risk, worked to fix it. This new perspective was the key that finally mended the rift with his father. He understood now that Arthur's anger hadn't been about the past, but about the future. It was a father's desperate, clumsy attempt to protect his son from the fear and uncertainty that had plagued his own life. Eli saw the courage it took for his father to finally break that lifelong promise and admit his own fear and shame. The conversation was no longer a standoff between curiosity and obstruction. It was a shared burden, finally laid down together. They could now talk about it, not as a secret, but as their history. The wall between them was gone, replaced by a new, stronger foundation of mutual understanding. And with that understanding came a new weight of responsibility. Eli was now the keeper of the story, not in the fearful, possessive way his father had been, but in an active, protective way. It was his job to ensure the truth was passed down accurately and respectfully. He was the link between the courage of his great grandparents and the generations to come. He would be the one to explain the glass door in the basement to his own children someday, to tell them about the children who hid there and the great great grandfather who built the wall to keep them safe. It was a responsibility he welcomed, a legacy he was humbled and proud to carry forward. The story, of course, did not end at the property line. The memorial was a conclusion, but it was also a beginning. The act of bringing the truth to light had started a chain reaction that continued to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond their small town. The Historical Society's exhibit became a permanent installation, drawing visitors interested in local history and stories of humanitarian resistance. School groups came through, and Eli would sometimes volunteer to speak, watching the children's eyes widen as he told them about the secret room right beneath their feet. The story was becoming part of the town's new identity, a point of reflection and a source of pride. Meanwhile, the search for descendants continued, now aided by the public nature of the story. The newspaper article and subsequent local news segment had been picked up by genealogy websites and history blogs. Emails began to trickle in, then flow. A woman from Oregon recognized the description of the O'Malley twins as her great-aunts. A man in Florida read about Benjamin Wells and realized the stories his grandfather told about starting over suddenly made a new heartbreaking sense. Eli and Sarah found themselves acting as facilitators, connecting dots between families who had all been born from the same act of salvation. They were building a new, sprawling family tree, its roots buried in a hidden cellar, but its branches now stretching across the country. The house itself took on a new, profound significance. It was no longer just the Carter family home. It was a place of pilgrimage for the descendants, a sacred site where they could come to physically connect with a past they never knew they had. Eli would welcome them, show them the room, share the photographs and the diary. There were always tears, but they were tears of gratitude and closure, not of grief. The house had been a place of hiding, a place of fear. Now it had become a place of healing. And all of this spoke to a larger truth, a truth that resonated with everyone who heard the story. This wasn't a tale of grand, sweeping heroism on a battlefield. It was a story of ordinary courage. It was about a carpenter and his wife who saw a terrible wrong happening in their community and made the quiet, terrifying decision to do something about it. They didn't have power or influence. They had a skill, a strong basement wall, and an unshakable moral compass. Their story was a powerful reminder that heroism isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the sound of a brick being carefully laid in silence. Sometimes the most world-changing acts of courage are the ones that happen in the dark, intended for no audience but your own conscience. The legacy of the hidden room was proof that even the smallest acts of defiance against injustice can echo for 100 years and beyond, weaving themselves into the very fabric of countless lives.